Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Cooperative Intelligent Transport Systems, and this is part 2 of a previous webinar delivered middle of last year. I will be your moderator today, and my name's Kathy Ducouris, and there's my contact details there. And our presenters today, we've got Freek Weber, who's our engineer in the network operations team. Hello Freek, how are you?
Hello Kathy. Hello everyone.
David Green has also joined us, who you might remember from last year's webinar. Hi David.
Hello Kathy, hello everyone.
And we also have Stuart Bilingual, who's joining us from the local Vic Roads office. Hi Stuart, are you there?
Hi Kathy, thank you.
Terrific. Stuart, if you can just try and get as close to your mic there as possible, just so that everyone can hear you.
I'll do that, no problem.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks very much, Stuart. So those of you who will be familiar with our webinar system, today's webinar will run for approximately an hour. 45 minutes or so is the presentation time, with plenty of time allowed for questions. Please don't hesitate to send your questions through as we go along through the presentation, and we'll stop at various points. You will of course receive a recording as well as a copy of the presentation via email. The questions where you can type in your comments or ask anything is the questions box there, and you can raise your hand if you would like some attention. Now, someone has already raised their hand, and I just wanted to check with you, Mandy, is there something that you can tell us in the questions box if you have a query? That'll be great. So I might throw over to you, Stuart, there for the introduction to today's webinar.
Thank you, Kathy. The objective of my brief introduction today is simply to set the context of the work that you're about to hear about. So what I'm going to do is give a brief explanation of what Cooperative ITS is and how the work that ARB has done here fits within the broader Austroads program on Cooperative ITS. So what is Cooperative ITS? As you'll see on the screen there, Cooperative ITS refers to the use of wireless communications between vehicles and infrastructure, and also personal devices. And what this does is it enables an ecosystem where systems are connected together to deliver outcomes that standalone systems are unable to achieve. And that image there will show you in an intersection scenario where we have vehicles communicating with other vehicles and also with the roadside infrastructure. If we move on to the next slide. So Cooperative ITS, it essentially already exists today in an early form. So vehicle telematics that you might have come across, such as heavy vehicle monitoring and real-time travel information services, are actually examples of, or early examples of Cooperative ITS, where vehicles are receiving data from outside systems. The next generation of Cooperative ITS, however, is going to utilise communications directly between vehicles and with infrastructure. We're expecting to see deployments of this technology in the next couple of years, and the work you hear about today is going to be focused on that generation of Cooperative ITS. The policy framework for ITS in Australia, the document you see there on the left on the screen, has nominated Austroads to take a lead role in establishing a framework to support the deployment of Cooperative ITS, and it's in that context that Austroads is undertaking this work. The diagram on the right there is an action plan for ITS in New Zealand, and that also references some of this work. Next slide. And so this is the final slide I have in my intro. This basically shows you the key focus areas of the Austroads Cooperative ITS program, which are regulation and policy, spectrum management, technical requirements, operational requirements, and the business model. The work you're going to hear about today with the concept of operations and the standards assessment are key elements of the technical requirements and the operational work that we're doing. So that's how this work fits within our broader program. And just a final point, it's worth noting that the two publications you can hear about today haven't actually been published at this point in time. They are in final draft version, and we hope to publish them before the end of the year. So I'd just like to remind listeners today at that point. So with that, I might throw over to Frank, who's going to talk to us about the concept of operations work.
Thank you so much for that, Stuart. And we've just got a slide in here to remind everyone out there that don't be afraid to ask any questions along the way. It is a bit early at the moment. We have had a couple of hands raised, so if those of you who have raised your hands, please type in your question or comment, or you've put your hand down now. Thank you, thank you. If you do have anything, just do type away in the questions box. But over to you, Frank.
Yeah, thanks Kathy. Thanks Stuart as well for the introduction. And in the next 15-20 minutes or so I'll be explaining you about the work we did for developing a concept of operations for Cooperative ITS core systems. And what I'll do first is explain about systems engineering and a concept of operations, so about the approach that we took. Then about why we need these core functions for Cooperative ITS, and then what are those Cooperative ITS functions and how do they work. So starting off with the systems engineering approach, coming up now. This is an approach that's used a lot in the US for complex engineering projects, for example, engineering a road, or in this case, Cooperative ITS. And the piece of work that I'm presenting on now is the concept of operations, which is one of the early stages of the concept of systems engineering approach. And then if we zoom in on that concept of operations, or what we did in this work is basically we did consultations with national and international stakeholders. We did a review of international documents, including standards. We drafted a concept of operations, which has then been reviewed by experts and also by an independent reviewer. And now we're in the process of finalizing this document, and then in the future it will be maintained as well and updated. And before we get into why we need these core functions for Cooperative ITS, I'll just go a little bit into what we can expect from Cooperative ITS in Australia. What does it mean for Australia, and when can we expect it? As Stuart said before, Cooperative ITS basically is already there in the form of telematic applications, but we're talking about the second generation of Cooperative ITS, which also include short-range communications and new applications, mainly safety applications. And these applications are being developed mainly overseas. Here are a couple of examples. In the US, you've had the safety pilots. Japanese have done a couple of deployments of short-range DSRC applications in Europe as well. And a lot of these international developments are formalized in standards by standardization bodies, which are shown on the right. So all of these developments, these internationally developed systems, they come into Australia, and obviously we want them to work well together and not have something like this, which is a bit of a mishmash of different systems, different devices as well. And basically they don't interoperate very well, probably also not with the different types of vehicles. This is actually a rather old Japanese taxi, so it's not something we would likely to have, but what we rather see is more something like what's coming up on your screen now.
I was going to say, Frank, that looks like a Melbourne taxi actually.
Okay, well, let's hope we get more towards something like this, which is a single platform. It's also multiple applications on a single interface. You can see the warning for the motorcycle is shown on the head-up display on the screen. over here, and also on the display in the vehicle. And obviously we want interoperability so that this BMW can also communicate to other types of vehicles, other brands. So we've summarized the user needs for these core functions, and I've listed them or summarized them here for you. First one is to align with international standards and developments, to achieve national interoperability, to achieve communication technology agnostic platform. Can work with different communication technologies. Also, communication has to be secure, and we need to be able to trust the data that's exchanged and trust the sender that's actually sending it. And also, we want to only allow authorized devices and applications to work in the system, and to remove misbehaving devices. And on top of that, also like to share data anonymously. So we've basically summarized that in 4 core functions, which the first one is a secure exchange of trusted data. The second one is assurance of privacy. The third one is sharing of data and efficient use of resources. And then finally, important for Australia is international interoperability and a nationally consistent service. And so what I'll do now is briefly go into how these core functions work. And then I'll start with the secure exchange of trusted data. And when that comes up, before that comes up, I'll say already that a lot of these concepts are based on international standards as well. So what you see here is a security credential management infrastructure, and basically this explains how you can have secure exchange of trusted data. In the lower left corner of the screen, lower left box, you can see basically a vehicle and a traffic signal interacting, and the vehicle sends messages to the traffic signal. And for that to happen in a secure and trusted way, you basically need two things. One is keys, security keys for encryption and decryption, and the other thing is security certificates, basically for the vehicle to show its real identity without giving the identity of the vehicle, of the driver. Basically to show that it's a legitimate device. So what you need also is an authority to provide those keys and certificates, and a registration authority to make that all possible. Then when we go to the next core function, which is assurance of privacy, basically we use the same security credential management infrastructure, and the reason for that is that these certificates, they allow for basically without giving your ID, still be able to tell that you're a legitimate device, and that allows for basically a privacy okay way of communicating. And one of the key elements there is that those certificates change over time. So basically your ID changes over time and no one can follow you over a longer period of time. Then the other element here is separation of roles. Basically, by doing that, none of the authorities has the full information, both of your security certificates and your personal information. And then finally, data messages are only being maintained for serving its intended purpose, and you have to consent or opt in for data being used for other purposes. Then going over to the third core function, which is sharing of data and efficient use of resources. Basically, there's two elements to this. There's a publish-subscribe function with registration to subscribe to services. And the second one is, again, as I mentioned before, the opt-in and opt-out for that basically enables users to share the information that they want to share. And then finally, the last core function is about international interoperability and a nationally consistent service. And for that you need nationally consistent requirements for what these cooperative ITS devices need to, how they need to work. And those are typically defined in standards. And to make sure that the devices in Australia actually comply with these standards or with these requirements, a certification process needs to be in place before devices can be registered. So before this vehicle can get its cooperative ITS device, it needs to go through a process of certification, and then it gets its certificates, security certificates, and can be part of the cooperative ITS ecosystem. So that basically explains on a high level how these core functions will work and how this platform can be realized. But a lot of what I've shown is actually not about the actual operation of cooperative ITS, but more about the support services, about providing the certificates, about certification. However, there is also a component of these core functions that is part of the actual cooperative ITS operation. And to explain where you can find these core functions in operation, I first show you this figure, which shows the different parts of cooperative ITS operation. It shows the vehicles communicating to the roadside infrastructure, and also to the centers, traffic management centers and business centers, and a mobile device as well. And basically each of these devices can be described in terms of the functionality in what's called an ITS station. This is basically a functional description of how these devices work, made by ISO, International Standardization Organization, and that ITS station describes the different components of each ITS station, basically separating applications from the platform, and it also shows within that platform which functions you would have. For example, management functions on the left, security on the right, and then from the bottom to the top, access functions, which include Wi-Fi, which include cellular communications or short-range communication, networking and transport functions, and facilities functions. And so within this sort of functional description of how these cooperative ITS devices work, you can basically point out where the core functions sit, and as you can see, they're mainly in management, facilities, and in security. So again, we've done this in a little bit more detail as well. This is the same diagram as the previous slide. We won't go into the details here now, but it's, we've broken that down into sub-functions as well. And basically, if you look at cooperative ITS operation in sort of all of these cooperative ITS devices, these core functions are present and should be implemented. So I guess that brings us to the end of this part of the presentation. So to summarize, the concept of operations basically described the different elements of cooperative ITS, and especially about the core functions in cooperative ITS. and those consist also of the operational part and the support systems such as certification, certificate authority issuing certificates, and registration of devices. And with that, I think we can move down the systems engineering approach V towards the more detailed system requirements and finally the standards as well. So I'll just hand over to David, who will be describing the standards assessment, unless there are any questions at this stage.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Frank. It's a very, looks like a very complex system. We do have some questions have already come through, so we might just stop for those now, and if anyone else thinks of any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to send them through. Our first question is from Rohan, who is asking the following. Is the IAP-TCA, EWD and other regulatory applications aligned with the Cooperative ITS project, and will it also require an IVU to be certified? Now there are quite a few acronyms in that one there.
Yes.
So
fortunately I'm quite familiar with these acronyms.
Fantastic.
So, I did understand the question, and I think it's a really good question because apart from aligning with the international developments, we also want to make sure that this works with the current systems that we have in Australia, the current applications such as the IAP or the electronic work diary applications that you mentioned, that Rowan mentions. I think that with these concepts that would work as well. Basically the requirements that are now there are certain requirements for regulatory applications like the AIP program. Those requirements for certification could still be applied to the certification framework that's proposed here. So I think that's that works very well. Even more so, the regulatory applications and sort of the institutional framework around that in Australia have been used as an example in the harmonization task group that's currently trying to harmonize standards around cooperative ITS between Europe and the US. So yes, that's definitely possible that those requirements are being incorporated in the proposed concept of operations. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. And I think, David, you might go into a bit more detail about that shortly.
Yes. If you don't mind, Cassie, I might add a bit to that. It's Stuart Ballingal here again.
Terrific. Stuart.
The framework that we've been working towards for cooperative ITS, it's reasonably well aligned with the national telematics framework that's being developed by TCA, and you'll find that we'll increasingly align it further in future as we evolve it. So yes, we certainly have been cognizant of the IAP, electronic work diaries, etc. Further to that, the security approach that has been taken with the deployment of IAP is one that we're using as a model for the security approach that we're going to take with CITS. Now the CITS ecosystem is more complex, but the security approach or the PKI approach that's been taken with IAP has been quite successful, and so we are using that as a model to build upon. So yes, we're very much looking to those deployments to build upon.
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, we might just take a couple more questions at this point and then we'll carry on. We have a question from Carl asking, how do people understand the benefit to themselves through the sharing of different levels of information? Without a benefit to themselves, they are unlikely to opt in. So you spoke about the opting in and opting out. I guess how do we educate people to understand that there's a benefit?
Yeah. Well, that's definitely a very relevant question, and I think it's important to distinguish between regulatory applications and between basically commercial service applications or voluntary applications. If you choose to register for a service, you tick the box that you've read all of the small letters, and usually that says that you are also sharing information. So that's one way of linking the benefits to also contributing by sharing their information. And the other way is for in the case of regulatory applications, yeah, there might be regulatory obligations to share data.
Fantastic, thank you. Daniel has a question on which organisations are part of the project currently.
Well, the project is done as part of the Australia's Cooperative ITS project. So through that, all the Austroads partners are involved, and then there's a steering committee which is in which the Austroads, mainly the state road agencies, are represented, and there is also an industry reference group which has a lot of the industry partners represented as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And Yin's asked, which institution or organisation do you see as appropriate to act as the trusted authority to provide certificates and manage the registration of trusted devices?
Yeah, that's of course a very very good and interesting follow-up question from this work. So obviously there are a couple of roles. They don't necessarily need to be performed by the same organization. So the registration may be done by a different organization than the one that issues the certificates. And I think it's now sort of one of the next steps is to decide which organizations these are going to be. I can give you some of my thoughts. Probably for certificates for in-vehicle devices, for example, some of the car manufacturers have indicated that they would like to do that, so they would like to get the role of trusted certificate agency or certificate authority. Possibly there will be an independent certificate authority as well for aftermarket devices, so there might be several certificate authorities. And yeah, also when it comes to registration, it still could be one organization for Australia, could be an international organization as well that does registration for Australia based on certification requirements that are international largely. So that has to be decided in the near future, I think.
Fair enough. Thank you again. Okay, we might. Oh, sorry, Stuart. Did you have something to add to that one?
Yeah, I do. It's probably worth me clarifying that a little bit. One thing this concept of operations work does is it helps to identify the functions or activities that we need to establish. It is not a purpose of this work to identify exactly which entity that should be. The intention of the work is to help inform those decisions. So there will be a process sort of over the next 6 to 12 months to progress those decisions, but it probably isn't appropriate to speculate who they might be right now. We will also be guided by decisions that are made internationally on how their security credential management systems will work, because where possible we want to be as harmonised and consistent as our international colleagues as we can be.
Great, thank you, Stuart, and we'll carry on with the presentation. So David, over to you. Please keep your questions coming through as we go on, and we'll have another short break shortly to cover those off. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Frank, for that presentation on the concept of operations. As Frank was outlining in his presentation, the concepts are based on standards, which which leads into the work that I've been doing on the assessment of international cooperative ITS standards and what I'll talk about in this part of the webinar. So I'll go through, I guess, an introduction and an objective of the project, talk about some of the available scenarios, the need for a minimum set of standards, the compliance that needs to be applied to standards, and the path forward from here on. So essentially, as an introduction, there's in excess of 160 standards coming out of Europe and USA. There's also some standards coming out of Japan and South Korea, but for reasons such as spectrum allocation in Australia, sort of 5.9 gigahertz spectrum allocation for V2V or vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communications, Australia is generally focused on the USA and the EU scenarios. So, and as a result of all this, Austroads is trying to, or is establishing a framework to adopt and adapt one of these scenarios for local deployment. And so in order to do that, they need to be informed of the emerging cooperative ITS standards, and in doing so they need to start assessing those emerging standards, which is where ARVA has come in to undertake this work, and this will be the focus of this part of the webinar. So essentially the objective of the project was to guide decision making with respect to the adoption of the international standards, and so in doing this we need to assess all the 160 plus standards, and with consideration given to their standards relevance for deployment in Australia, any changes or barriers that need to be overcome for their adoption, any conflicts that might arise, and some of the compliance that needs to be undertaken for these standards to be adopted. So I thought now might be a time just to ask the webinar audience a bit of a question as to why they think standards are needed, and more particularly why standards are needed for cooperative ITS. So happy to get some of your feedback on that. But essentially from our perspective, a standard is a document that provides the specifications that can be used, that can enable a consistent approach for products to be developed by various manufacturers, and to ensure that those products are fit for purpose. And what the standards do is they make industry more efficient by breaking down barriers to international trade, and by making like-minded products built by different manufacturers function in a similar way. They also provide, and this is where it's particularly important for something like cooperative ITS, which deals with vehicle safety, is they also provide reassurance to consumers that a product that conforms to a standard is built to a satisfactory level as defined by it. And so one of the key components for CITS is the ability for vehicles and infrastructure to be able to talk to one another. So these standards ensure that interoperability can be achieved. So the next slide, I'll talk about some of the available scenarios, and the first one being the USA scenario. And so this concentrates on delivering 5.9 gigahertz DSRC, V2V, vehicle-to-vehicle critical safety applications. And generally the USA scenario that we assessed, it comprises of 11 standards, of which 7 were identified in this project as being of high priority for adoption. The next scenario is the EU scenario, and this comprises of standards coming out of the ETSI or standard organisation, and these are largely driven by the car manufacturers and are focused on 5.9 gigahertz communications. And the EU scenario also has standards coming out of CEN ISO, and so these standards are focusing on mainly facilitating hybrid communications within the CALM concept of the ITS station. And so you have a mandate, that the mandate M453, which kind of splits the responsibility between the ETSI and CEN ISO. So essentially you got the for Australia, you've got the two scenarios, the USA scenario and the EU scenario. And so while there are some differences, there is also some harmonisation work going on between them. So the choice for Australia is really to choose between those two scenarios. And so in order to deploy Cooperative ITS in Australia, we need a minimum set of standards. And these essentially comprise of existing standards for technology used in Cooperative ITS. You've got the CITS Foundation standards for day one, which would also be applicable for years 3 to 5 and 5 and beyond. And then you've got the standards that are associated with future applications. So as CITS evolves, it is expected that the standards associated with the scenario will evolve as well. So essentially for Australia and New Zealand, it's all about, at this stage, defining what those existing standards for the technology used in CITS and those foundation standards for day one are as the minimum set of standards for deployment. And so I guess another question that I have for the audience, and feel free to give your answers, is why is compliance to standards? Why do you think compliance to standards is needed?
Good question, David. We'll give everyone just a minute there to have a think about it and type a response in. If I can throw in my response, I think it's got something to do with perhaps not having the example that Frank showed earlier of the Japanese taxi. Would that have something to do with it?
Yeah, well, in part, I guess, essentially, I mean, because Cooperative ITS is all about vehicles communicating to one another, it's fine to have the standards, but if two vehicles aren't compliant to the same standard, then that dialogue won't be able to happen. So compliance to standards, particularly around applications that are deemed to be essential or safety related or safety critical related, it's vital that that compliance be undertaken so that those applications can function in a desired manner. So essentially, compliance has you've got different levels and different types of compliance. So onto that point I raised just earlier, you have standards that can be voluntary compliance or can also be regulated. So often many standards is voluntary to comply to them. It's up to the manufacturer. But in some standards that for some products or for some functions that are deemed safety critical or have other relevance to, say, environmental or other functions that the governments deem they need to be followed, they can be regulated. And so essentially compliance can be regulated or voluntary, and then there's also different levels of compliance and different types of compliance, which I'll go into in the next slides. So the compliance levels include third-party certification. So this is where a third party may certify a product. So for example, in the vehicle industry in Australia and Europe, third-party certification is undertaken. And so when a vehicle is certified, they're able to put up a compliance plate, such as shown on your screen on their vehicle, saying that they've been certified by a third party. Another example is second-party certification, so where an association or group certifies a product. So for example, the Traveller Information Services Association, they certify traffic message channel location tables on behalf of that industry. And then the third level is first-party certification, so where an individual or an organisation self-certifies their products. So in the USA, their vehicles are certified, self-certified, so the manufacturer goes through a checklist and certifies their vehicle for release onto the market. So essentially, they're the 3 levels of certification. And then you've got the compliance type. So the compliance type could include an individual inspection, so where each product is individually inspected. Type approval, so that is a sample of the product prior to release is reviewed and compliance is given based on that. Or you can have audit and surveillance. So once the product is in operation, then a sample of that product may be audited and to check that it complies with the standards. So they're essentially the compliance types. So some of the activities that need to be undertaken to enable deployment of cooperative ITS in Australia is the need to adopt a minimum set of standards, the need to choose a scenario. So for Australia, that is a choice between the US and the EU models. And then also there is a need to be involved with international standards developments and international harmonisation activities, which Australia is already been involved in up to now through different committees such as ICTC 204 and the harmonisation task groups. So essentially this would enable CITS to be deployed consistently. I've also talked, New Zealand would also be adopting, would have their own national platform, but this would likely be based primarily on the Austroads work as well. So essentially some of the path forward is the need to seek further clarity on the scenarios by participating or engaging in trials and initiatives, to work with local stakeholders to establish a confirmed consensual direction with respect to the CITS deployment locally, to adopt the required minimum set of standards for the chosen scenario, and to confirm the compliance level and type required for each adopted standard and whether that compliance, and to determine whether that compliance is regulated or not. So that brings an end to essentially my part of the webinar, so I'm happy to open it up to any questions that people may have.
Thank you, David, and it's a really challenging task you guys are undertaking here. There's a lot of information there and a lot to try and, I guess, choose the right path for Australia. Stuart, just to make sure you're still with us as well, is there anything else you wanted to jump in with at this point before we do take some questions?
No, I don't have anything further to add. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Stuart. Okay, we do have a question from John, and John is asking, I'm not sure how much detail you'll be able to go into this one, but currently what are the main differences, i.e. technical and operational, between the US and EU scenarios?
Yes, yeah, well, there is quite a lot of differences at all the different levels within the scenarios, and our report that is going to the Austroads to be published later in this year kind of goes into that in detail. But yeah, there's essentially differences at the security level, and if we think back to Frake's presentation and the ITS station, and so you had the security, the management, the applications, and the various levels. There are differences in how those two scenarios will operate. So there is a need for Australia to choose one of those scenarios, and they're not able to have a hybrid of the two. But having said that, there are a lot of similarities between the two scenarios, and there are also a lot of harmonisation going on between them. So without going into too much detail, I hope that kind of answers your question, John.
Thank you, David. We have a question from Amal, who's asking about the proportion of the opt-in, opt-out. How would that affect the success of the project? For example, if only 50% of road users opt in, does it affect the benefits to the road users? Is there any benchmarking in this regard from international practice?
Yeah, I think the opt-in, opt-out is going to be a real issue. Because it's cooperative ITS, it really relies on people being able to talk, and if people aren't communicating, then it is a challenge. So I mean, that's I guess a broader challenge than this project. So it's really, I guess, trying to come up. What governments are trying to do is establish, and what Austroads is trying to do is establish the framework for the industry to be able to come up with the applications to deploy, and that the market will want to adopt. What the killer apps are is yet to be known. But the industry, I guess, is working on that, and people will adopt as required. There's also the American or the US is kind of moving towards decisions around the mandating of at least the broadcast of the safety message within the vehicle, and Stuart or Frank can add a bit more detail with respect to that. But that is one way to at least get the communication or the broadcast of your message out, whether that vehicle wants to run the actual application within the vehicle. That will still be a choice for them, but it will at least mean that that vehicle has to broadcast a message out or its heartbeat to be able to be used by other vehicles in the area. And Frank, did you want to add any more? Or?
Yeah, I think that mandating broadcasting safety messages is not on the agenda in Australia at the moment, so we won't see that happening too soon. But I think that already people are sharing a lot through social media and through their smartphones. Through a sort of a similar model, basically, if people would get their applications and then in return share the information, then I would see that happening for Cooperative ITS. But it's a good question whether that's actually going to happen. And again, for specific applications, some of them might work with a lower penetration of equipped vehicles, and others might need a higher penetration of equipped vehicles on the road. So there's a difference there as well.
Okay. Just for I guess my benefit from a novice perspective, is I guess some of this is similar to, you know, having your smartphone and allowing location services to be turned on and that sort of thing. So you're sharing where you are, which the benefit to you is that it helps you find what you're looking for quicker because it knows where you are. Is this along the same lines?
Well, yeah, you could have applications provided by your car manufacturers, or you buy a new car and you get the option to get Cooperative ITS in your new car. And then by accepting those applications, you would also accept that your location is being broadcasted for safety applications for other vehicles.
Yeah.
So that's how I imagine it would work.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a couple of our New South Welsh people. So we have a couple of people that have mentioned a trial from Transport for New South Wales running a trial on Cooperative ITS rest stops. Is this work aligned with this program, or is this a separate project?
Yeah, well, that's been run by John Wall in the Transport for New South Wales. And so, yeah, he's, I guess, generally picking up. They're more interested in the applications and and testing those applications. And so they're using, I guess, what available standards they can to be able to communicate or to be able to run those applications in those trials. I guess what our projects are more about is defining, I guess, the platform that would ultimately be deployed and for wide-scale deployment rather than, I guess, the specific trial.
Yep, fantastic. So you guys are really coming up with, or not you, the project is coming up with a foundation for how all this will work in the future. Yeah, well, Frank mentioned earlier about the CITS steering committee. So John Wall is part of that. So he regularly updates the group on that trial and how it's going. And so I think from memory, he's using the US standards in that trial, but for no other reason than they were available to him for use. But yeah, I mean that trial will. I think Stuart.
Probably worth me clarifying. There are two separate projects here. The one I think the question was about was the Smart Rest Area project, which is in central New South Wales. While that's a Transport for New South Wales project, it's different to the one that John Wall is heading. That project is utilising cellular communication to advise heavy vehicle operators of upcoming rest areas and what facilities they might have and what vacancies they might have to address fatigue issues. We, as Austroads, are certainly providing input to that project, but it is a slightly different technological approach. But we are ensuring that it's a collaborative approach, so it is being guided by some of the work that Austroads is doing. The other CITS trial that was referred to there is the project with Wollongong. That is using DSRC technology, and yes, it has been largely based on the best scenario. Once again, Austroads is involved in helping to ensure the collaborative approach. Also.
Thank you, Stuart, and that related to your question earlier, Mandy, on the trial in New South Wales for you. Okay, well look, I think we'll take one last question. We will send you a copy of the recording as well as the presentation material after the webinar today. And David's asking, are there any day one applications in mind?
Yes, earlier on in the piece, there's Austroads released a strategic plan which outlines the day one or the applications that they got in mind for that are considered to be the major applications of interest for deployment by Austroads.
Fantastic. Okay. All right, well, I think that's all for questions. Of course, if you would like to talk further with any of our presenters today, their details are on your screen now, and we will send you that as well. So for more information, Frank, David or Stuart can be contacted, and we'd really like to thank you guys today for presenting the update to how this is going. It is exciting to think that, you know, that this is the groundwork for what we'll all, I imagine, or some of us will be using in the future. And thank you very much for taking the time to share that today. Thank you for joining us, Stuart, from down the road there, and join us again for our next webinar, which will be advertised shortly. Bye, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.